our forearm stand, also known as feathered peacock. The Sanskrit word for that is Pincha Mayurasana, and you can say hello to my dog Yam, that's who's walking in the background. So forearm stand is, it's a very challenging pose, right? Because it's an arm balance pose. We are balancing on our forearms, and it really adds a layer of complexity compared to a handstand, because with a handstand, all you have to do is balance on your hands, right? But with a forearm stand, now you're adding this bend into your arm. So it can get a little bit complex. And a lot of times for me, I use forearm stand as a peak pose in the practice. So everything I'm doing in the practice is leading up to a forearm stand, so that my students' bodies are prepared for that pose. And they're learning strength and flexibility poses along the way so that they can just build that in their body to get into the pose, maybe not that day, but at a later date. So if you are teaching a class where, you have a bunch of advanced yogis in the room and they're just ready for a good challenge, then adding a forearm stand throughout your flow may be maybe something you do for teaching your class. So I'll talk about both of those as we go in. We did have two comments come in from Eve and Westy on transitions. So let's dive into those first, and then I'll go back and talk about what I like to do for the forearm stands. Let me just flip over real quick to see if any comments have come in. Since I'm in Zoom, I don't get to see your comments if they come in. Okay, so no comments yet. All right, so Eve had talked about in her comments, lower leg slowly to the mat. So this is coming out of forearm stand. Lower leg slowly to the mat with control. Push up from forearms to hands to down dog. And if the strength is there, maybe if you down dog press ups, then to a vinyasa. Okay, so this is really nice. So let's talk about forearm stands. In forearm stand, you have your forearms to the earth, and you're just basically standing on your forearms, forearm stand. So you're up here in this position, and Eve's talking about slowly lower the legs down. You're here, then press into your palms to come into down dog. And then if you're feeling a lot of strength, you could take some down dog press ups. So just gently lowering your forearms down and up, forearms down and up. And that does take a lot of strength to do. So Eve, I love that you had listed those. Now, what you can also offer your students there is maybe just take one at a time, up, up, and then down, down, up, up, like this. Or you could even have them take it from like a box, or also known as tabletop. So you can go from here, lower forearm down, come up, and then make sure you reverse that direction. So that's still giving them the same movement, the same sensation, and then maybe they do both here in the tabletop position and up. It's still working the strength in the forearms and the triceps when you do that, whether you have your knees down or you're on your toes. So great suggestions, Eve. I really like doing the strength after the forearm stand, right? Because you need all the strength for forearm stand, and then afterwards you could do some strength building exercises. So great transitions there. Our next one came from Westy, and she had talked about using the wall. So pull mat up perpendicular to the wall and work on dolphin pose first, and then into Sphinx pose for a shoulder break, and then into Pincha, and then come down for a shoulder stretch. So let's break all that down. Dolphin pose here. So dolphin pose is just like your down dog, except you have your forearms to the earth. So she talks about being here and then play around with kicking up into forearm stand, because you have the wall there. So you can kick up, and then your students have the wall. Just be mindful of what your students are doing. If they're slamming their heels into the wall, then they're using too much momentum to get in, and encourage them to use their core to lift up rather than the strength of their legs. So then she said to go from there down into a Sphinx pose. So, this is really nice. So you're going with the theme of forearms to the earth, and then you just come into a Sphinx pose here. And then from this position, she said to lift back up, maybe go into forearm stand again. So maybe have your students play around with the opposite leg. So if they were using their right leg, maybe they try with their left leg. And then to come down, and I love this shoulder stretch she did. She said to come to the wall. You can stand up. I'm going to stay on my knees just so you can see me. And she said to bring your hand to the wall, hip to the wall, and start to twist for a shoulder opener. Ooh, that feels so yummy. So I'll go this way so you can see what I'm doing. Hip to the wall, shoulder to the wall, and just start to turn. And when you do this, just be mindful of the positioning of your arm. You'll want to have your thumb in line with your nose as you open through your shoulder. And you could even do like cactus arms here for a little bit different sensation. So that's such a nice opening in the shoulders. So great variation in the poses that Wesley had offered with that transition, because you're going from like an intense activating pose such as forearm stand, and then you're doing a more passive pose like Sphinx, and then you're going into forearm stand again, activating, and then you're doing a more passive pose here with the stretch of the shoulders. So I love that combination of poses. Westy, great job with that, and thank you, ladies, for sharing those transitions. It's always so fun to see what others come up with, just to really, spark ideas within your own teaching. Okay, so those were the two that came in. Now I'll share some of the ones that I like to do. So I talked about how forearm stand can be a peak pose, or you could use it in a sequence. And so I'll start with how you can add forearm stand into a sequence if that's what you're offering to your students. And normally when I offer forearm stand within a sequence, I offer it as an option, just so if a student is not there in their practice, they don't feel like they have to do it, or they feel left out because they can't do it. So always being mindful in your choice of words when you're offering those deeper variations. So one that you can do is from a wide forward fold. So if you have your students here in a wide forward fold, it's pretty common for teachers to offer like to go into a tripod headstand, or maybe even a supported headstand. But you could also offer a forearm stand here. Make sure my foot's not going to hit the wall. So if you're here, you could have them work on a wide-legged forearm stand where they're just taking little floats like this, and maybe they'll float up into a wide leg forearm stand, and then you could have them bring their legs together and then have them exit out the same way they came in. So they're right back here, maybe hands come to hips, and then you stand up and you're like moving into something else in your flow. So that could be an option. And what I'll say is in a wide forward fold, you have the option to go into a forearm stand and play around with that variation. And if you're not sure what that is, you can take a look around, maybe give it a try, or just hang out where you are. So I try to make it, very lighthearted in the class for my students. So that's one way you can add a forearm stand into the wide-legged forward fold. So that could be a nice transition there. Another one you could do, which is what Eve was talking about, from the dolphin pose and just lifting up or kicking up into forearm stand. And so this could be done in the middle of the room. It doesn't have to be done at the wall. So you could go from the dolphin into forearm stand and then out, and then as Eve had talked about with those down dog presses. Another place I like to add forearm stand into class is during an active rest. So let's say in between sun salutation B and a main flow that I'm doing, I'll say, feel free to go into child's pose, take an active rest. If today's an invigorating day for you, you can come into your plank pose, maybe take some push-ups, or go into a forearm stand. So you can give them options during that time, because maybe some students in your class really don't want to rest. Maybe they just have a lot of energy and they want to keep going. So you could offer that during a rest when you have some students in child's pose, and some may be doing like a little bit of playtime where they can explore the forearm stand. So that's an option. Another transition you can do is from headstand. And I'd recommend doing this at the wall with your students first, and then having them do in the middle of the room. So you're going from a supported headstand into a forearm stand. So I'm here in my forearm stand, and from this position, I release my grip, plant my palms to the earth, press my forearms into the ground and lift up into forearm stand. And then you could come back down. So clasp your hands together and very slowly lower your head to the earth. And then you could come down out of your headstand. So that could be a fun transition to do to offer your students. So let's say you're working on headstand at the wall, then you could give students who already have their headstand a new challenge by working on pressing up into forearm stands. All right, so those are the transitions. Now, as far as like some modifications you can do for forearm stands, some fun ones, you could, for forearm stands, and I think some people call it like funky arm forearm stands, you could have one forearm to the ground and then your fingertips to the ground for your other hand, and then you would just kick up into forearm stand here. And then for me, it's easier just to take my legs like this. And so you could play around with some variations like that. It's really fun and challenging to do. So if you're working on forearm stand in your class and you notice that one of your students is, having no problem getting into forearm stand and they seem very comfortable with it, you could offer them that variation for it. You could also take a lot of variations with the legs in forearm stand. So if you're up in forearm stand and you're here, you could play around with like eagle legs here. You could play around with a wide split like we did. And I think I'm too close to the wall, but let me see if I can turn. You can also play around with twisting like this, and then maybe come through center, twist the other way. You could work on your splits. You could even work on scorpion pose here. So lots of different things you can do with your legs in the air. So just kind of get creative with your students and again, offer those variations to them if you feel like they're ready for that challenge. So I talked about, or I also mentioned, I use it in my flow and then also as a peak pose. So when you're sequencing your class with forearm stand as a peak pose, you want to look at all of the areas that are needed to get into forearm stand. So lengthening and activating through the back of the legs, making sure shoulders are open, so shoulder flexion. So in your classes, you'll want to focus on those areas, right? What are some poses you can do to help open the shoulders in preparation for the pose? What are some things you can do to make sure that the back of the thighs are warmed up, right? Because you're in this position, so you're really lengthening through the back of your thighs, and you want to make sure that you have good flexibility there, because if the flexibility is not there, then you just have to work a little harder, right? To get into the pose. So I really like to think of arm balance poses like shapes in geometry. So if you think of like a triangle, right, you have to have your angles properly aligned in order to make that triangle, or if you make like an octagon, right? The angles have to be in a certain way. Well, with arm balance poses, it's the same way. Your joints have to be stacked a certain way so that you're not having to work so hard to get into the pose. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means that you're having to exert more energy than you would need to. And the alignment of your body and the stacking of the joints is really going to depend on the person's anatomy, and it's going to be different for each person. And so as a teacher, that's where it really comes into play to make sure that you're looking at your students and you're knowing what their body can do and how their body is responding to a pose.